For almost 100 years, World Horse Welfare has been improving welfare within the horse-human partnership through care, research, education and influence. We help horses in need, horses in work and production, and horses in sport and leisure. World Horse Welfare supports the ethical use of horses in sport and is a critical friend of horse sport industries. We are an independent welfare advisor to the FEI and British Horse Racing Authority and offer advice to other national federations. But increasingly, public acceptance of the involvement of horses in sport is under growing scrutiny. Society is suspicious of the use of animals in entertainment. They're worried about how horses are bred, cared for, trained, competed, and what happens to them when their careers are over. Horse sport's social licence to operate is increasingly being challenged. At the same time, our knowledge of what horses need to have good welfare and a good life is expanding. Many in the horse world now understand that some traditional practices must change, and they don't like aspects of what they see in horse sport. Horse sport has been tackling this head-on, and regulators and others have moved forward with initiatives to improve practices and perceptions of the welfare of horses in sport. But what progress has been made, and are they moving fast enough? Today we will explore how horse sport is working to strengthen their social licence and whether they're taking the public with them.
A very warm welcome and thank you for joining us at today's briefing, where we will explore how much progress we have made within horse sport to maintain public acceptance, our social licence, since our first event last year. World Horse Welfare believes this conversation is vital because it will play a part in determining the very future of equestrianism. We support the ethical and responsible involvement of horses in sport, and we know that good welfare and horse sport are not mutually exclusive. But equally, we recognise that all within equestrianism need to demonstrate this more, with actions as well as words, to maintain public support. At last year's event, we proposed 3 actions. Firstly, to work with the media to make communications on horse welfare in sport more engaging. And it is so encouraging to see so many members of the media with us here today, both in person and online. Secondly, for horse sport to work more collaboratively on this whole issue. And we applaud the various commissions, initiatives, conversations, and everyday changes that have been undertaken over the past year. And thirdly, for World Horse Welfare to continue measuring public opinion on the involvement of horses in sport, which is why we commissioned YouGov again to conduct this independent research. They posed many of the exact same questions as last year to more than 4,000 adults, twice as many as last year, but still representative of the UK population in terms of gender and socio-economic background. As you can see, some of the results were consistent with last year. Over 60% of the public are still not content with the status quo, with 1 in 5 respondents opposed to the involvement of horses in sport under any circumstances, and an additional 2 in 5 accepting it only if welfare and safety are improved. Similarly, 3 in 5 want more welfare and safety measures in horse sport. What has changed is how media coverage has affected their confidence in sport horse welfare, with 1 in 4 saying it has negatively impacted it, compared to 1 in 6 last year. No doubt, some of the headlines, including the Grand National, would have influenced this. But what this does clearly show is that media coverage can change views. But there is certainly positive news. The vast majority of the British public accept that horses can be ridden, with only 15% disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. Those represented by the red bars are those who in the sample regularly interact with horses. And as we would expect, they are especially supportive of riding. So when comparing respondents who regularly interact with horses with those who do not, there are many similarities, but also some differences, with horse people more likely to support the continued involvement of horses in sport, more likely to believe that existing welfare and safety measures are enough, or that indeed there are too many welfare and safety measures, more likely to believe that horse welfare is prioritised enough in communications, and more likely to be confident as a result of recent media coverage on welfare. However, we should be very wary of the bubble of how we in the horse world view horse welfare. The data does show that horse people are more likely than others to be content with the status quo, or indeed to think protections go too far. But this is out of step with the general public and with the majority of people within horse sport who still want to see improvements. So reflecting on these results, we know that improvements in public opinion won't happen overnight, not least because the public will not yet see the full spectrum of how much is evolving in horse sport, or the changes being made, not just by regulators, but by the individuals who are working towards providing their horses with even better lives. One of them is William Whitaker, who could not join us today. And before I hand over to Lucy and the panel, William has shared his own personal story of how he challenged the status quo and is changing the way he keeps his own horses to give them a good life according to their individual needs.
I think for me personally, and I know sort of our philosophy at home, is basically we want to keep improving all the time in everything that we do. And for me, the health and welfare of the horse is number one, basically. That comes first. Because if you've got a happier, more content horse, in the way that it's living, you can have a better horse and a horse in a better frame of mind that you're going to be able to, work with and train. I have a horse, he's called Arnie. He's a 9-year-old gelding. He's owned by a guy called Brad Hill, who's a vet. And the horse he's quite a highly strung horse. And he'd had a few, I suppose, issues in the past with basically trying to keep him settled in his surroundings. He was always, quite highly strung, never really settled in the field. If the conditions weren't right, same in the stable, quite anxious in the stable, like kicking the wall, that kind of thing. So then we found it was difficult. One, we were worried about him injuring himself, and two, he was forever knocking his shoes off and that kind of thing. So when I explained a little bit what the horse was doing, so then he got in touch with a friend of his who specialises in horse behaviour. She's a vet as well. So then she came back basically with a lot of different ideas for us to try. She said some things will work better for some horses, some things will work better for others, but these are the things that we have done research on and found helps problems that he's having, basically. So then it was kind of my job to look at the situation and basically try the things that I thought would work best for him, really, and that we could facilitate here at home. He was very territorial in his stable, so as soon as it came to like feeding time or anything like that, and when all the horses get a bit excited that the food trolley's coming round, he'd really try and attack other horses if anything was walking past, and he'd back up and kick the wall in his stable. So then we tried him in a bigger pen, so he had more, because he's quite a big horse. Tried him in a pen, and it was better, but was still doing the So then she said, well, what would be good for him is if he could basically have interaction with another horse quite closely. Obviously, it would need to be safe that they don't start fighting and can injure each other. But if he can kind of have a social life with another horse as such, that would help him basically. So I said, we've actually got these pens at home, and each second pen has got like a feeder ring in the middle. So two horses eat out the same ring basically. So they're kind of looking at each other when they're eating, and then the next two pens they're looking at each other. And she said, "Oh, can they touch and that kind of thing?" So I said, "Yeah, they can touch, but they can't. You know, if something was to happen, they can't actually kick each other or that kind of thing." So she said, "Well, try that. That could work really well for him." She said there will probably be in the beginning a little bit of an argument until they figure out who's boss, and then they should be fine. So then we found by that yeah, he was much more settled, even at feed times and stuff like that, which was great to see. And also another thing that I mentioned to her was in the collecting rings at shows, said he can get quite horse shy. Doesn't like it when other horses are around him. So she said that would help with that as well, being able to touch and basically relearn how to deal with other horses, which was the case, and he was a lot better for it. What was actually great with Brad was, because the horse is a very good horse, he's potentially be like a very valuable Grand Prix horse. But so like with new things a little bit like that, I was thinking, what happens if a fight breaks out and he jumps out of his pen and hurts himself? Brad was like, put him in, you know what I mean? Because you're kind of in it a bit together then, So then obviously that got the cogs ticking then. So then I was thinking about other horses and how they behaved in the stable. It really came about in winter. Obviously, when the weather's bad and the fields are wet, you can't turn out as much. We built like a sand pen indoors, so that basically we could put the horses in there, after they'd been exercised, and they could go in and they could have a roll and that kind of thing, and they could just sort of, just relax in there and have a bit of space to move around and that kind of thing. When turnout was not as freely available because of the weather and everything. I think with horses, if you ask, I know certainly in my family anyway, if you ask any one of them, there's one thing that will be the same from everyone. If you ask them, do you ever stop learning in the horse job? And that's absolutely not. You learn something new every day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. We are missing one panelist, but he's due to arrive at any moment. In the meanwhile, to discuss some of those issues, some of those findings in broader detail, we've got a panel of 4, soon to be 5. In fact, here he is. Marvellous. Right on time. Thank you, Theo. Come and join us. There's an empty chair. We have, you're on. Perfect timing. So we have 5 equestrian experts who are going to explore some of these themes in more detail for us today. To my left, we have Julie Harrington, who's been Chief Executive of the British Horse Racing Association since 2021. In a previous life, she worked for Northern Racing for 8 years, and she's also held very senior roles in football and cycling. Next to her is Meredith Smith, who's been an equine vet for over 20 years, and managed to do on top of that a PhD while working and living in Newmarket. She specialises in equine surgery and advanced diagnostic imaging, and she's officiated as a vet at a range of horse events and race meetings, besides being a horse owner and rider herself. Sam Griffiths is a familiar face to many of us who follow sport, especially eventing. He's an Australian-based rider based in Dorset, a former badminton winner, and he's won an Olympic team bronze medalist. Nowadays, he combines riding at lower levels with being head coach to the New Zealand eventing team. Theo Plogmocker, straight off a plane, well done, Theo, is an engineer by training who became a show jumper. He's held a range of senior positions in the equestrian world, particularly in the Netherlands. He's president of the European Equestrian Federation and a board member on the FEI, and he's also a member of the FEI's Independent Equine and Ethics Wellbeing Commission. And finally, but certainly not least, Rishi Persad, who many of us know. He's been a broadcaster on TV and radio around racing and eventing for over 20 years and other sports. He inherited his family's love of racing from a very early age, and he's also a trustee of the Racing Foundation. So thank you, panellists. I wanted to start today by asking you about that figure that was revealed of the number of respondents who felt their confidence in horse welfare has been impacted negatively over the past 2 or 3 years by media coverage, despite the work we're trying to do to improve that. Rishi, do you have an idea why that might be, and how can we prioritise welfare more in communications as people want us to?
Well, we can certainly do more of that. We can always do a little bit better. But I certainly believe that most people in the world that we live in today, they don't have enough time to pay attention to as many things as perhaps we used to back in the days when I was growing up. But now we have the situation where things become topical. They become part of the conscience for that moment. And it's interesting that the survey was conducted relatively close to when the Grand National took place. And of course, the Grand National was big news, bigger news this year than it has been for previous years. And we know why that is, because of those who wished to protest. And so it became part of the public conscience. So I do believe that that has an impact on how people view our sport. Because the majority of time, people allow the sports to exist without major concern for the animals. And there is an element of trust between the general public and the sports that are involved, whether it's horse racing or equestrian. They believe that, I think, they allow us to get on with it because they have faith and trust that we are doing a good job. And then, of course, things happen at specific junctures, whether it be something at the Cheltenham Festival or Aintree, and therefore it slightly distorts, I feel, the general public view of things. And also, and we spoke about this, Lucy, is the fact that a lot of the times the general public don't have an idea of what is involved in terms of what we provide in our sports for the welfare of horses. Were they to have the full knowledge, or at least part of the knowledge of the amount of work and the amount of care that goes in to looking after these animals, then I think that would also help. But then that goes back to the latter part of your question, that there is more work that we can definitely do in conveying exactly what that is. But of course, we have to use the right opportunities at the right time. And when we have an opportunity with a big audience like the Grand National, unfortunately, the Grand National coincided with us having that opportunity to tell people how well we look after horses. And then, on the other hand, people were criticising the sport for its existence and the race for its existence. And so they sort of cancelled each other out. And I think perhaps it was this year distorted even more than it has been in the past. And I think in a clear thinking society where passions are limited, then I think people would have a better understanding and be able to appreciate the work that has been done by so many people in the sport for making it better for the horses. Yeah.
Do the findings of this British survey reflect similar feelings overseas? Theo, I'm looking at you because you've worked a lot across Europe. You know a lot about the situation in countries like the Netherlands. Are there lessons from other European countries for us in Britain?
First of all, yeah, it reflects exactly what's in other countries. If you look to the Netherlands and also the survey that's done by the Equine Ethics Commission from the FEI, it's all coming in the same. Majority support our sport, but have their concerns. And if you compare it with other countries, then you will see that there is a big difference in Europe. That has to do with the fact that certain countries are different than, for example, the big traditional equestrian countries. A country like Sweden, number one all the time in Europe about social license, already long time, even before the sport was in the picture. They have a society that is so concentrated on social license that everything equestrian is doing is under scrutiny from society. Secondly, they are a smaller country, so it's easy. So what you see is that many countries in Europe that are not that big have a better control over it. And last, all those countries don't have the traditions that you have, special, for example, in the UK. And we all know changing things when traditions are at stake is very difficult. So you see much more movement in other countries in Europe based on the fact that they are not as long in the sport as they are, for example, here in Britain.
Julie, turning to you, your industry is the only one in Britain where there is lots of licensing and training required to set up a yard in racing. And racing's been working very hard over the last 2 or 3 years to improve public appreciation of the sport and its social license. Are these efforts paying off, and are other disciplines learning from racing?
Well, I certainly think that licensing and regulation should be seen as a good thing. And not just for us as a regulator in terms of having confidence about what is happening out at home in the sport rather than just on the field of play, but also for our participants, because they have a regulator standing behind them saying, we are checking this regularly, we are confident that there isn't poor practice there, but also for the participants, because poor practice can influence can impact their own businesses. It only needs one of their colleagues to have a bad news story that goes viral and everybody's impacted. So I do think licensing and regulation is a good thing. And I think we are making a difference. There's a huge amount of work being done by the Horse Welfare Board, and I know that Barry and Helena are here either virtually or in person, and also ROR. In terms of that life post their racing career. So a huge body of work. But going back to Rishi's point on comms, a lot of that work is about getting a really strong body of evidence so that we can confidently say to the general public, based in science, with facts, about the interventions that we've made to make the life of the horse even better and even safer. And I think we're not resting on our laurels. And you asked if I thought others could learn from racing. Absolutely, but also we are really keen to learn from other areas of equestrianism. And I know that there is a huge amount, at the grassroots level, there's a huge amount of work being done to share good practice, because we don't exist in a silo. We know that something happening in an Olympic sport can alter the perception for racing and vice versa.
Yeah. Mary, as a vet, I know you're quite encouraged by a lot of the welfare progress that's being made, but you have also wondered if more equestrian ventures and businesses and other sports wouldn't benefit from some form of licensing.
I think it would be fantastic if every professional yard across all disciplines were licensed, and licensed according to standards set out by their own regulatory bodies. I think that there could be many positives. I know that inwardly yard managers would groan at the idea of more paperwork, more legislation to conform to. However, I think the positives could be that within that yard, if standards were accredited standards and one could show that one's yard met these standards, I think you would be immediately providing reassurance to the public in terms of how your yard was run. I think that could in itself allow for staff to feel a greater sense of pride and ownership and commitment to their yard. It might help with recruiting those staff. It would certainly be more appealing for sponsors. And at the lower levels, when people are really struggling to get a yard up and running and developed, I think sponsorship is so important, and it's so important to show to them that everything that you are doing is to the best of standards as per your regulatory body there. And then, of course, undoubtedly, I think there would be benefits to the horse. We can look at the disciplines at all levels, and of course at the very top levels, horses are generally looking wonderful. They're living the life of lives there. They're extremely well cared for and looked after and supported, and generally the money is there to ensure that that is so. But we have to consider every animal within the range of the discipline there, and look at the very small yards and make sure that we are championing those horses that are perhaps of less ability, less financial worth, and are perhaps within circumstances that are less pristine and less ideal, and make sure that as an industry we are supporting those and keeping their welfare needs and requirements at the forefront of the sport too, and not just focusing on the good luck and success stories at the higher end. So yes, I would love to see every professional yard licensed, and I think it could be a positive all round, an absolute win. I do think we're making progress. It's fantastic that we have these various independent bodies within each discipline now that are airing and discussing the problems, but I think it's essential we take those problems further and we develop them into actions that become statutory and become changes that are in place for the good of the horse, and we don't just stop having aired the conversation.
And Theo, we know some of your work you've done, you know from other surveys that people worry a lot about what happens to horses outside of the field of competition when they're not in the public eye, how they're managed, how they're trained at home. Presumably some form of wider licensing would develop the trust the public has in sport horse fraternities.
I think so. I would support if there is a licensing system. When you look to all kinds of other organizations or industries, if you want to do something, you need a license. And we are, I think, one of the few left. You can start what you want. You can start a riding school, you can start a yard, you can do everything. Where on the other hand, we have an extra responsibility because we are working with an animal, with a horse. And that is not protected in no way. So I really support the idea that we say there's a level. And I know, and maybe I say something too much, but in the FEI there is, at that moment, a discussion. If you want to go to international sport, then you have to pass a certain test to see that you have everything in place to go on the higher level. And I think if that is really working, we also should look to the amateur sports. Because again, we are working with an animal and we have to protect the animal. So I really join you in your...
I have to put this to Sam now, because you are the rider with the yard who would be impacted by all of this. How would you respond? How do you think fellow riders would respond in your position to this kind of change?
Yeah, I don't disagree with the idea. I think it's good, but I'm a little hesitant. Now, the reason being is a lot of people start the sport. They don't do it for money. There's not much money in the sport at the lower levels. They really do it for the love of the sport. Now, I know as a competitor that even just getting to events with lorry regulations and things like that, it created a huge amount of red tape. And at times it almost put you off the sport a little bit because you felt you were over-regulated. So I think we need to balance that. But having said that, I would not be opposed to perhaps a body like the FEI, particularly the higher level competitors getting spot checks done at their yard. And I'm sure the riders would be very comfortable with that. So there is a balance to be reached, that we're not getting over-regulating and almost forcing the smaller people out of the sport because there's a mountain of paperwork to do, which they don't have time, they don't have money, and they can't afford to do it.
There are some within the sport who worry that social licence is actually going to impede their ability to compete, to ride, to train, as they always have. You know, they feel that whips might be completely banned. I mean, how do you feel? How much does that attitude pervade? And how do you feel about the rate of change, say, in eventing, which has done quite a lot over the last 10 years?
Yeah, I think a lot of the eventing riders are comfortable. The sport has done a lot over the last few years, well, decades, to make the sport better and a lot safer. So with the technology of frangible pins, and for those people that don't know what that is, it's sort of a fixed fence on the cross country with a certain amount of weight. If a horse hits it, it will collapse. You know, I think that sort of revolution has been fantastic for the sport. I think people realise that we do it because we love the horses. Like I say, that particularly eventing at the lower levels, we don't do it for any financial reward. And so innovations like that have just been great for the sport. Now, it's not to say we can't get better and do more, and the sport's trying. But I think a lot of people feel comfortable, but yes, we can do better and portray ourselves better in the media.
And I know in previous discussions you've said, possibly where we do need a bit more teeth, perhaps in eventing, is in the FEI officials being firm in their decisions, being supported in their decisions. And this is something we've talked about as well. Mary, you've officiated as a vet at lots of events. How do you feel it works at the moment?
Gosh, it's a mixed bag, really, I think. Of course, vets are an essential part of the behind-the-scenes personnel on the day of any event, whether it be grassroots level or an FEI level. It's important or essential that they are there, and of course they're there to deal with the injuries or accidents that occur on the day. But you can look at that aspect of the job, and then you can look at perhaps what one might see as a vet on duty or as a ground steward in terms of perhaps less than ideal behaviour from riders or trainers, horses perhaps being kept in situations that aren't perfect. Maybe they're on the lorry for a little bit too long, perhaps they're tacked up and are warmed up for long periods of time, perhaps the stabling or the washdown areas aren't as they ideally should be. And it's very difficult when you're at competitions to perhaps impact these things, or to make suggestions or recommendations, or to feel that these are even heard. I think often they can be sort of sidelined, or that the competition is the thing of the day and is taking precedence, and actually the welfare of the individual horses there on site is perhaps sometimes secondary when it shouldn't be. I would love to see standardisation in all accident report forms, so that it was very, very easy for all ground support staff to log accidents, problems there and then as they occur while memories are fresh. It would be fantastic if that was standardised within a database, and then I think it would be fantastic if more conversations were had in terms of the minimum level of site equipment and amenities available to horses and riders, some influence and guidelines for things like standing in lorries, waiting tacked up, waiting for your opportunity to enter the arena, horses being overworked prior to competing. So there are lots of little aspects there that I think could be addressed, and it'd be lovely to see more power given to some of the officials who are there on the day, after all trying to safeguard the horse during their performance for that day.
I think one thing people wrestle with, particularly outside that sort of bubble of the horse world, is the fact we talk a lot about the welfare of our horses, putting our horses first, and yet we are prepared to risk them over fixed fences in horse racing, and they struggle to sort of, to square that conundrum. Rishi, how would you respond to that side of it?
Well, I think it starts with a personal conscience and your own congruence, whether or not you believe that what you're doing is the best thing for that animal. And we've, again, spoken about it, and history we cannot rewrite. The thoroughbred exists. There are some organisations that would like to rid the world of the thoroughbred. But unfortunately for them, and thankfully for us, the thoroughbred is part of our lives. That the idea that we have these majestic, beautiful animals as part of our lives is something to be appreciated. We give them purpose by what they do, and we remove as much of the risk as we can. I mean, Julie's sitting next to you, and she's part of an organisation whose one of their main functions is to protect the horse and its competitors. And that's one of the reasons that they exist, to make sure that everything is in place for a good life for these animals. And ultimately, those horses don't go out to jump a fence untrained. They are prepared as professional athletes to take part in these events, and they're given the best training possible. And we have therefore given them purpose, and we've given them as much love, care, attention, and preparation to take part in the sport that provides a lot, social, economic benefits, etc. And the horse is well looked after, and those horses that have a tremendous, the majority, not, there are always improvements to be made, and there are certain aspects that could always be better. But the majority are given a great life. And then we have to decide whether or not, in our own conscience, whether we're okay with that. And I would say the majority of people in the sport, whether it's eventing or horse racing, have come to terms with that. And therefore the sport as a whole, because it's made up of all those individuals, have come to terms with the fact that what they're doing is best for that animal.
And Sam, you've ridden some of the biggest courses in the world. You must think about this sometimes.
Yeah, as Richard was saying, that the horses and riders are highly trained when they get through to the high levels. Probably 5 years training you're talking through to get to Olympic level. So it's not like you just walk out there. And it is the case that if you have a 500 or 600 kilo animal, if they don't want to do it, there's nothing you can do. So I genuinely feel the horses really love it. I know I've finished some courses and it'll be something you could never quantify, but I've genuinely known my horses have absolutely loved it. And so there are risks in life. The eventing, as I was saying before, has tried to reduce those risks by making collapsible fences. And so, yeah, you're going to be faced with risk with whatever you do. We try and minimise it and keep trying to improve that. But I'll just go back to saying that you can't make a horse do what they don't want to do, and I can genuinely say they love it.
Just responding to Rishi's name check, that they, you know, I understand, you know, your point in the question around contrasting this, you know, often in thoroughbred horse racing, that, you know, pampered life at home. But the reason they have that high level of care and that high health status is because they do have a purpose. And I think my worry is often more with those horses who maybe don't have that same purpose and that same value, because that is the reality. But also, as Rishi said, that there's a huge body of work in ensuring that, yes, there is some risk in sport, and that is inherent in horse racing for both the rider and the horse. But we're doing everything we can to minimise that risk, as you would hope, and with a huge caveat, because this is absolutely work in progress. But I was talking before about having an evidence base, and all of the interventions that we're doing, it's about measuring. Are they working? It's like the film we saw earlier about, you know, we're trying new things, are they working? And if you took the Cheltenham Festival and the years of 17 and 18 and you contrasted that with 20 and 21, albeit that we're thankfully talking about statistically small sample sizes, but all of those interventions around pre-race checks, fitness to race, changes to the obstacles, focus on the ground, has reduced over that period the risk of a life-threatening injury by over 35%. And you know, again, that huge caveat that this is work in progress. We need a longer study, more statistical robustness. But that's exactly, we're not resting on our laurels. We keep pushing on this.
Can I just jump in? Mary made a really good point earlier on about, you know, the top level athletes, the top level competitors, and lower down the scale. I would say hand on heart that certainly in racing and in eventing that I've seen, you know, yes, the top ones, you turn up at all the big meetings or the big equestrian events and they all look magnificent. But for example, you go racing today they're not glamorous Aintries or Cheltenhams or whatever. You have a look at those horses in the paddock. I'm pretty certain they're all going to look amazing. And that's because all levels, the majority of people who look after these animals, they are so passionate about whether they're racing, sorry, Julie, for £2,000 or £200,000. They don't care about what the value of the horse is in terms of monetary evaluation. They care about the horse itself, and they show you that in when the horses turn up to compete. They all look amazing because these people do it for, as Sam says, for the love of it, mostly.
So one of the challenges we face is trying to communicate some of this to this broader public that has an opinion but very, very little engages with horses. Actually, I'll throw this one to you, Julie. How do we try to convey messages, that the strides we're making and the efforts we're making with welfare to a public that isn't very involved with horses?
That was a real figure that chimed with me in the research that Rowley presented earlier, that only just over 2% of the population regularly interact with horses. And for me, that's a worry on a number of grounds. One, you know, everybody consumes their media through social media nowadays, and if it's not part of their life, they won't be getting any of the positive stories that are served out on social media. So how do we break through that bubble? I do think our participants can really help here, because nobody has more of those good news stories about the real life imagery about the care that horses are getting at home than some of our trainers, who can tell the story of what happens to a horse on its first move out of racing. So I think that is definitely something we could do.
So trainers, jockeys, stable staff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that also worried me about those numbers is that across all equestrian sport, but certainly in racing, it's really difficult to recruit staff into those horse-facing roles. And if only 2% of the population are having regular contact with the horse, that's a really small pool of people to recruit from. And in future, if we're not getting more people interested in working with horses, interested in, you know, how much their life can be enhanced by being around horses, we're going to have an even bigger recruitment issue, which will in turn create a welfare issue, because we need experienced horsewomen and men to care for our horses.
Are there still positives, Mary, that we can find in today's survey findings? Where is the good news in that? How positive do you feel?
There is good news, and certainly over the last 5 years, this conversation around social licence has grown and grown and grown. 5 years ago, it wasn't a concept that we discussed. We weren't really considering it. Now we are considering it, and we're considering it for real reasons. We must be mindful of the position we are in based on these quite stark statistics. We can look at our positives, and there are positives. We have these independent boards now in most of the disciplines. Obviously, there's the Horse Welfare Board, who developed their Life Well Lived strategy within racing. They have now implemented 16 of 25 actions there. They are actively progressing areas of concern to try and improve things. We have an FEI Independent Welfare and Ethics Board. This is fantastic, and this is new, and these things will help. But this is a big but, really. It's human nature to air a conversation, share a concern, feel that we are discussing things, and then think to ourselves, okay, good, things aren't so bad. We're all right. We've talked about this, we've reached some opinions, we've made some decisions that perhaps things in these areas could be improved. And what we need to do is take that and then translate that into actions and into changes that will actually affect the horse in a positive way, directly and quite quickly, really. We can take those actions and those changes, and then I think, just as Julie and Rishi and Sam have been saying, we need to develop those into positive stories that we can share with people who don't see a horse every day and who don't really understand our industry. We can share them by perhaps having more open days, more family fun days, and involving groups and communities like the Beavers and the Scouts, schools, in cities and areas where people very often don't see a cow or a farm animal or even a horse possibly ever in their younger lives. Bring them out in any way possible, whether it's via online or social media, but bring them out into our world in a way that is not seen as elitist, or in a way that is not seen as something that requires an awful lot of money to even begin to participate in. I think we really need to look at that and make the horse and enjoyment of horses something that really is for everybody. Anybody can go camping in national parks, and they can perhaps enjoy the beauty of the wild horses down in Dartmoor, New Forest, and perhaps see the socioeconomic benefits of those horses living wild in our beautiful England. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to try and link up with more within our industries individually, and try and sort of enhance and improve on our relationship with the non-horsey public to try and steer statistics a little bit more into our favour.
And Sam, you and I have chatted earlier this week. You made the very good point that, you know, the footfall speaks for itself to some degree. We still have a lot of support in horse sport.
Yeah, very much so. Obviously, we need to listen to everyone, but I know that 6 of the top 10 sporting events in the UK which Richie gets to go to most of them, are equestrian related. And so I think there's a bit of a silent majority that we can't ignore. And I know sort of the Badmintons and Burleigh, they get around 170,000 people through their gates over those equestrian events. And they're not that cheap to go to. So, people must really love it to be involved and get to go. So I think we can't forget those. And also even from my home country back in Australia, that we have the Melbourne Cup. It's run on a Tuesday and they make it a public holiday on a Tuesday. So I think we can't forget we do have a silent majority. I'm not saying we should ignore other people. We definitely need to get better as an industry, but we can't forget them.
Brilliant. Well, at this point, we are going to... Oh, go on, Theo.
If you allow me.
Of course.
There's one important thing that I'd like to bring to your attention. In the survey that was done by the Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission from the FEI, there's a very big difference between the levels. If you look to the outcome, then you see that the people on the international level feel that not so much has to be changed. Where the people under, let's call it the amateur or national level, feel that many things have to be changed. And I think if we talk about how we can get that to the public, then we really should look into this subject particular, because international sport is maybe in the image and in television and all that. But underneath is a lot of people involved in horse sports that have their concerns. And I think if we don't address that one properly, you never get it through the public, because that's the biggest majority of the people in the sport. And I think it's very important that those get an idea that we are changing and that we are doing certain things.
Yeah.
And it's not only the whip and the spurs. Sorry that I maybe take some time from you, but it's much more. We talk about overuse of horses. Courses that are built in a certain way that it is very difficult. And that is what we have to address, so that the biggest majority from our sport gets the feeling, yes, we are doing it right.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
then
absolutely.
you get it to the public.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you. We do have a few minutes to take some questions. We have some online, but yes, fire away, Heather.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm Heather Keller on Horse and Country TV, and to pick up on Theo's point, the amateur sport is absolutely critical in the communication exercise that we have to undertake. So there's been a lot talked about the need to communicate and to almost re-normalize the use of horses in our society. And I absolutely agree with that wholeheartedly. But one of the points in the results that I found very, very interesting was the difference in perception of people who are involved with horses, those that are inside the bubble and those that are not. And I wonder if I could get the panelists' thoughts on the importance or the value of actually communicating with those people who are inside the sport and sensitizing them a little bit more to the fact that this issue exists. Many people who are inside the sport just seem to have no idea that this is a problem. And if we could turn all of those people into influencers and communicators on behalf of the sport, then I think that could be a really powerful army.
Thank you very much. So the question really is, how do we convey from those sort of very much in the bubble inside the sport to those outside of it that this is a really live issue they need to be talking about and addressing and helping promote the messaging, I suppose. Rishi, you're smiling as though you have something keen to say.
I started smiling because you mentioned about getting everybody on side together, getting the sport together and trying to get them to understand why we need to maybe understand the threat of perception from the public.
Easier said than done.
It's so much easier said than done. I mean, poor Julie and the BHA have been taking a lot of stick about the whip, for example, and the use of the whip and how it's regulated now, with despite having consultation with jockeys and everybody, with putting a group together within the, and yet even now we still have people who believe that we still haven't done the right thing and that it wasn't necessary, and they seem to misjudge the fact that we have, you know, in terms of, say, for example, I think it was a Labour government manifesto which suggested that the whip was a threat, or that the perception of the whip to the sport was a threat. And yet there are people still within the sport that seem to think, well, the whip doesn't hurt, which we know there's been science that says it's not a tool for hurting the horse, but the perception is that. So we need to come together, as you rightly say, to make our case that actually we all want to be in agreement with this, and we all want to present the united front that what we are doing is good for the sport, for the competitors, for the people that are involved and responsible for it, but also to assuage those who have their own perception of the sport, whether they, you know, whether it's an educated one or not. And that is unfortunately a challenge within the challenge, and it's a layered challenge, and we can't even get there yet.
I think you touch on a really valid point, and some of the language that is used would accuse all of us, even for having this event today, for their words, not mine, pandering to the extremists. When all of this work, you know, there are some people whose ideology we will never change, but all of this work is about the silent majority whose perception of a sport can be swayed by what they see through the media. And I think we just have to be confident that we're doing this for the right reasons, because we love our respective sports, and we want to be confident it's still going to exist for the enjoyment of future generations.
We've got another question. I'll take one from online and then come back to the audience here, if I may. But one question is enough consideration given to the welfare of sport horses over the whole of their natural lives? So we know they have a fantastic life on your yard and yard like yours, Sam. But, you know, a horse that's been competed at a very high level doesn't always translate into a leisure horse in later life. How much thought and care goes into the horse's whole life, Sam?
Well, I like to think quite a lot. Like I said, a lot of people start out in the sport because they love horses and not for financial gain. And and that they'll follow those horses through their entire career. I know that some horses that haven't quite been able to go into other sports for various reasons have all had good care. That, you get such a partnership with your horse that that it's something not easy to break, and my experience is they're well looked after.
And owners are on side with this, you feel? Owners understand their responsibility for a horse's life?
Well, again, the owners will usually support those horses because they love the horses, and because they love the horses, they care for them.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the key parts of social license is about trust with the general public, and with trust comes the need to be transparent. And I think for all horse sports, actually having that traceability of where those competitors are in their life post racing has been a problem for us, and I think there is a lot of work being done so that we can have confidence to be transparent, to talk about what is happening for every horse that is bred for sport all the way through to the end of its life. And I can see we've got David Catlow from Retraining of Racehorses in the audience here, and that is precisely core to their work, that life beyond competing. But I know all equestrian sports have the same.
I'd like to chip in there from a veterinary point of view. Now, with every horse in every discipline, of course, there will be veterinary treatment required, some very little, some moderate, some quite a lot. And I think something that vets are very, very keen to develop and work on is the idea of centralising medications, use of treatments, treatment plans, things that are procedures and things that are interventional for these horses during their careers and during their pathways within their profession. Now, this is controversial. It's often something, or usually something, that people wish to keep very much confined to knowledge within the yard and within the training environment. But from the horse's perspective, if some of this information is centralised and shared, still in a very protective fashion, it is possible then to map out how individual horses are coping with what's happening to them and coping with their careers, and how suited they are to perhaps going on into different disciplines and being supported successfully in that transition. I don't think it is helpful for high-level horses to be sold on to amateur riders with the hopes and expectation that they will continue to perform well at high levels, when actually they have accrued a reasonable amount of wear and tear and damage, which is only to be expected. And I think what we need to do as the industries across the disciplines is be very supportive of the accumulation of wear and tear and the fact that animals do suffer injuries within these disciplines, and work out how best we support them positively moving forward, so that we're not accused down the line of misusing and abusing horses and over-treating and over-medicating, and then expecting too much from these athletes as they near the end stages of what's been potentially a very hard-working career.
There's a point here that ties into what Theo was talking about earlier about different traditions in different countries. Somebody online has asked and said, many horses in sport do not currently have their basic sort of physiological and ethological needs met, so friends, freedom and forage. I think in Sweden it's illegal for a horse not to be turned out every day, but we do have many racing yards here where there is no grazing. We have show jumping, showing yards that have very little grazing in this country. I mean, what can we do to encourage sports to really change our view on traditions and perhaps think, well, we've got to do better than that? How do you feel about that, Theo?
Yeah, I think you have to start with saying what a good life for a horse is. I mean, we can talk about going out in the yard an hour or 2 hours, but first you have to define what is a good life for a horse. And as soon as you have that clear, which you can also publicize and tell everybody what you feel, then you have to go back and say, how can I materialize that one? And that is for me the two things. We talk about one and we do different. If you go to an event, you see there are still many events that doesn't give you the minimum requirements. And okay, the event is over. The horses have been there for 2 or 3 days without maybe coming outside, only walking around. But if we feel that it is an athlete that we should respect and that we should recognize a good life for him, then he has his needs also during the event. And then we should honor that one.
Yeah, absolutely. It ties in with what William was saying about continually learning what different horses need and listening to them. Yes, David.
Thank you. David Kaplan, training racehorses. We talked a lot today about risk. It is very clear that we have done in the industry a great deal. We're talking about what more can be done, and I sense a real mood in the industry to really move forward on all these areas. But we know that 1 in 5, 20% of people feel that horses should not be used in sport, according to the survey. And none of us know what that survey looked like 25 years ago, but we all suspect that that number is growing, and we suspect that it may grow still, just the general mood in society, that animals used in society, how they're used. We know we cannot eliminate risk entirely, we can reduce risk. So how do we as an industry start to contextualise and communicate to the general public that risk of injury and fatality will always remain in horse sport? How do we communicate that? Because we can't ignore that very important part of the equation that I sense is driving on the public. I don't feel, but I don't know, that their concerns are that the horse stood too long on the wagon, or that the yard wasn't regulated, or that they didn't have enough turnout. I think the fundamental question is injury and fatality of horses used in sport. And so how do we contextualise and say, how is that acceptable?
How do we contextualise injury and potentially death of horses in the playing field, in competition? How do we justify that and contextualise it? Meredith, as a vet, you see horses at their best and lowest moments. How do you think we contextualise it?
I think one thing we could look at, and it'd be wonderful to have an up-to-date large survey done, is look at horses just living their lives out in the field and look at the numbers of accidents that occur. Now, of course, these are accidents that are perhaps due to the horse's behaviour rather than somebody riding them. They may be accidents due to weather or freak occurrences. They may be accidents as a result of colic or natural illnesses, but they are still accidents and injuries and wear and tear and accumulations of damage that occur just with horses out in the field living their life. And we have now a very, very low percentage of horses that run on the track sustaining a fracture that ends up in a fatality. It's a very, very, very small number per starts of racehorse run. However, we don't know what that looks like relative to how many horses might trip in a rabbit hole, sustain an injury that results in a loss of life or an ending of a riding career away from something like what's considered to be a high-risk sport. And I think trying to look at the entire picture might help a little bit with some of those statistics. It's a very difficult question, but animals across the board are suffering for all sorts of reasons in all sorts of ways. And of course, many of those things are not at the hands of man. Many of them are, but they aren't only about racing or the sports horse industry. And I think looking at the bigger picture, I think sometimes might give us a little bit more of a balanced perspective.
Balanced view, yeah, absolutely. Other questions? Yes, Eleanor.
Just thinking of what Sam was saying about the horses enjoying their job and how it's hard to quantify, but you know, this horse has had the time of its life going around there because you can just tell. Is that something we could try to communicate more? Because if a dog's going for a walk and you say, the dog's had 3 walks today, everyone will go, oh, lucky dog, as in that dog's had a great time doing its exercise. Is there any way to try and communicate it's similar? The horse has had a great ride around the woods or around a cross-country course. Do you see what I mean? Can we communicate the horse is enjoying itself?
Yeah, how can we, so I think the question is, how can we convey that horses enjoy themselves? Apart from King Boris, they don't wag their tails. I think that's the only horse in history that ever wagged its tail. Yeah, Mary.
Can I throw in a very small bit of recent science? The ridden horse pain ethogram is a lovely way of objectifying the horse behaviour. Now, the aim of it was really to look at horses being ridden, whether it be at home in the arena or under competition circumstances, and to try and objectify things that we see, like ears back, a fixed stare, a way of moving, perhaps a stiff back, a tail swishing, lots of comparatively individually quite subtle behavioural characteristics that actually you can start to score and quantify and then come out with a result that puts horses into a category whereby they are performing less well and showing less consistent objective enjoyment, if you like, or relaxed behaviours as a result of what's being enforced upon them. And I think we can take that same model of behaviour and objectify horses just going about their day in a field, or the pleasure that we believe a horse is feeling after a fantastic jump, a fantastic round, where they come and you can see them in many, many photographs or video footage there. Their ears are pricked, they're proud, their chests are puffed out, they're really, even though they're tired and they're sweaty and the rider's exhausted and all's been an arduous task there, you can see, if you are an animal person, that there is some feeling of a job well done and some feeling of pride and satisfaction that's coming from that animal. And what we need to do is to look to the behaviourists and take that anthropomorphic view of what we think we're seeing and objectify it and say, look, yes, absolutely, here's a score that suggests to us, with all of the science that we know, that everything about that horse is reflecting enjoyment, a relaxed status, happiness, pleasure, all of the things that we believe create a life well lived.
I do think, though, that we do convey some of that already, certainly working in eventing and in horse racing. You speak to some of the competitors, some of the people involved in it, working in it, and they do say it, but often we take it for granted. And we take it for granted in communicating that to the audiences, that the audience know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
When we say, you'll come back in after jockeys won a race and you say, look at it, he'll say, you look at his ears, how much he's enjoying himself. Look at how he's walking still, he's full of life after that race, etc. And we take it for granted that the people at home understand it. Now, you mentioned the point about dogs. Well, obviously, the way things stand in the world, you mentioned the 2%. Unfortunately, people understand dogs now more than they understand horses. That is the way the world is. And so it requires more effort from, obviously, the media, the competitors and the people who work in the sport to convey the science behind a horse and their anthropomorphic features. We have to do better. And I think we are doing better. We are doing better. So one of the big challenges is that when, say for example, on ITV, we do our regular weekly coverage, and most of the times we are broadcasting to people who are already horse racing fans. They already know these things anyway. And then when we come to the big meetings, when we have different challenges where we've got to be careful because we're dealing with an audience that doesn't understand it. And then you have to do explaining, you need time, you need the experts, and it's a bit more of a challenge. So it's not easy, but it's certainly achievable.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions from the floor? Yes, at the back.
Michael Baines, Chairman of World Horse Welfare. I'd just like to really congratulate Channel ITV because you do a fantastic job, Rishi. In fact, it almost creates a problem because you actually do speak to a wider audience and therefore we've got to respond. The only thing I haven't heard today, to be sort of the back of my mind, is if you think of this in commercial terms, you've got sales and marketing. You sell a product. You've also got to build a brand by marketing. And I don't ever hear any of the regulating bodies and the sort of the groups, the Eventing Group or the Racehorse Authority, actually thinking, how do we build that brand so we communicate to those people who aren't actually following it every day, so that when something goes wrong, and it will because horses get killed, actually there's already something in the bank. And those people who want to jump on it have to recognise that actually, you've got the people on the one hand who are always going to criticise and be difficult and want to stop it, but it's the vast bulk in the middle who unfortunately can be too easily persuaded because of social media. And if there's something in the bank that can be referred to, that's what building the brand is about. And I really urge the industries to think about that, not just about the detail, because at the end of the day, when something goes wrong, people aren't interested in the detail. They're much the big picture that matters. That's my only observation. But great.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, it's a really strong observation about building the brand of equestrianism across all the disciplines so that there is knowledge and, I suppose, data and information that the sort of people who could go either way when there's a problem might grasp. It's a really interesting observation. Yes.
Follow on from that?
Yes.
I think
Okay.
GBR, Great British Racing, are doing a fantastic job of that. They're bringing a wider audience behind the scenes. They're showing the sort of the animals, being looked after, and they're doing such a fantastic job. I just feel like we need the equivalent across the equestrian world as well, Great British Equestrian or something like that.
I'm so glad you chipped in on that GBR role, because GBR's role is to try and get that cut through behind a brand, but it is, as a career marketeer, it's an incredibly crowded brand space. So you've obviously got the Ascot next week, that's the lead brand. You've got Cheltenham, you've got badminton, but trying to have this sort of umbrella brand that can deliver positive consumer messages is exactly what GBR does. But it has a finite budget, and actually to get the level of cut through in those busy lives that Rishi talked about at the very beginning, is incredibly expensive. And whereas a beautiful foal shot has the opportunity to go viral, and I think all of us, seeing the figures that Roland presented earlier, I think all of us can play our part.
Well, we could talk for another hour easily. There are so many good questions coming in, but please can I ask the panel to stay seated while Rowley is going to give his summing up.
Thank you very much. It's amazing to be here at the Household Cavalry, if you're in person, to hear behind the Queen's Lifeguard come in, and a place of such tradition, but also a place that is also very forward-thinking. I think that is the key for us today, to be proud of the heritage of the equestrian sector, but also to be forward-thinking and to build on those really solid roots. And I just want to say thank you to the whole panel, and to Lucy, to Julie, to Mary, to Sam, to Theo and Rishi. And it sort of made me think, the wealth of experience that is available through the panel, but also the evidence we have found through the YouGov survey we did last year and this year, and we'll repeat going forward. That evidence base is so important because, we hear about it so much. Making evidence-based decisions is vital to that, building that trust and transparency in maintaining public acceptance. And I would also add, where that evidence does not exist, that we do take a precautionary precautionary principle, but also invest, double down to make sure we make that investment in future research, because it is the lifeblood of being able to tell that story, that narrative about all that's good in horse sport. So many of the things that have been discussed today around licensing, around enforcement of the rules, around the importance of independent oversight, but also having that ethical debate, that constructive ethical debate. And I think that word constructive is so important in such a polarised world that we so often live in. So that was my first point. The second point, and it was talked about a lot today, about taking the complete view. It is very tempting to focus on the field of play, on the race course. But of course, a sport horse is a sport horse for its lifetime, from birth to death. A racehorse is a racehorse for its lifetime. And certainly that's how the public view. So we need to make sure that we're having an equal focus, if not more of a focus, outside the race course and the field of play, because that's what's right, but that's what the public expect. And so we make sure that we do have those processes in place for after a horse is born all the way through to the end of its life. And thirdly, and I think the momentum that's filled today is about keeping moving forward. I mean, I think we can all agree that the sport is definitely moving in the right direction. And we know that that's going to take time to have an impact on public perception. But it is vital that the sport continues to be proactive, continues to take the lead, be brave, take action, and encourage this culture that challenges the status quo. And, small actions really do add up. So lots of small actions are pretty much the same as one large action. So we've got to think it is just the small steps as well as the large ones. And maintaining public acceptance, of course, is, as the old saying goes, it's very much a journey and not a destination. And we certainly look forward to travelling with you all along this journey. I can tell you over my experience over the last 24 hours, there can be some good days on a journey and there can be some absolutely horrific ones. And so on the more challenging ones, that's where we need to be together as well. Because as William said, from the great Whittaker family, we must always continue to learn and to act. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.